David Kenny was a young man leading a typical life. Upon reaching the age of 21, his mother decided to host a grand celebration in his honor. Among the attendees was Sherry, an attractive single mother who came with her son. Throughout the evening, David felt an intense attraction to Sherry, sensing an immediate bond. The following day, he confided in his mother that he believed he had found his soulmate and was resolute in making his relationship with Sherry official. Despite Sherry's commendable attributes, some individuals within David's social circle expressed skepticism regarding his choice to marry a woman with 3 young children, highlighting the significant responsibilities that such a commitment would entail for someone of his age. Nevertheless, David was a young man brimming with dedication and affection, prepared to embrace the challenges of becoming part of Sherry's family and creating a fulfilling life together. To ensure he could support his new family, David enrolled in a training program to become a coal miner, a demanding and hazardous profession that offered substantial financial rewards. During this training, he met Brad McGarry, who had grown up in Cambridge, Ohio, in the 1970s. Brad faced numerous obstacles as an openly gay individual in a conservative setting, enduring discrimination and prejudice, yet he remained steadfast in his authenticity. Over time, he cultivated a close circle of friends and pursued a career in hairstyling, which proved to be difficult in a small working-class town. Eventually, Brad made the courageous choice to transition to coal mining, a stark departure from his previous profession. David and Brad quickly formed a strong friendship. David and Brad had developed a close friendship, with Brad becoming a cherished member of David's family, affectionately referred to as Uncle Brad by David's children. The two friends were nearly inseparable, frequently sharing laughter and enjoyable moments together. By 2017, David was 30 years old, happily married to Sherry, and their children were maturing. In contrast, Brad was managing the demands of his work, family life, and a clandestine romance. On May 7, 2017, after attending a family gathering, Brad informed a cousin that he needed to return home for a meeting scheduled for later that evening at approximately 6:15 p.m. When David, Sherry, and their youngest daughter visited Brad's residence, they were taken aback by his lack of response at the door, despite his car being parked outside. Growing concerned, they proceeded to the back of the house and discovered the service door was unlocked. After calling out for Brad without receiving an answer, David entered the home while Sherry went upstairs. David's search led him to the basement, where he encountered a horrifying scene: Brad's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. Upon hearing her husband scream, Sherry rushed downstairs and was equally horrified by the grim sight. She immediately dialed 911, prompting the police to be alerted to the tragic discovery of Brad's body, the victim of a fatal gunshot wound. When the authorities arrived, they found David and Sherry visibly shaken as they recounted their visit to check on their friend, which had turned into a devastating tragedy. The couple shared details of their close relationship with Brad, highlighting the profound bond that had developed over the years, including the many holidays they had spent together. Children regarded him with affection akin to that of an uncle, and they had even made plans for a trip to the Bahamas with him in August of that year. When inquired about any adversaries or troubling situations in Brad's life, David and Sherry revealed that Brad had recently concluded a tumultuous relationship with a man named Scotty, although they were unaware of his last name. They characterized the relationship as being fraught with conflict, marked by frequent heated arguments. After gathering as much information as possible from the witnesses, the officers began a meticulous examination of the scene before reaching any conclusions. In the basement, they discovered Brad's body lying face down on the floor, surrounded by a large pool of blood near his head. At first glance, it was evident that he had sustained at least one gunshot wound to the head. Despite the clear indications, the officers initially speculated that Brad might have been experiencing significant distress and could have taken his own life. When the forensic expert arrived at the scene, he inquired whether the officers had located a weapon, to which they responded negatively. However, given that it is common for individuals who commit suicide to fall onto the weapon, the forensic team decided to turn the body over. Upon doing so, they found no weapon, which quickly dispelled the initial theory of suicide. As they continued to assess the house, the police endeavored to reconstruct the crime scene. They observed that the house appeared to have been ransacked in an unusual manner. The kitchen was in disarray, with several drawers left open, and the living room was also in a state of chaos. The authorities initially suspected that Brad's death might have been the result of foul play. Following a robbery that appeared to have gone awry, detectives conducted a meticulous examination and discovered that no valuable items had actually been taken, despite the presence of several that were worth stealing. They also observed that Brad was an avid collector of rural-style art, and his residence housed numerous valuable possessions. The fact that the television remained untouched and money was scattered across the floor raised suspicions about the authenticity of the robbery. Considering these clues, the police became increasingly convinced that the incident had been staged to mislead them. Given that Brad was an openly gay man employed in a coal mine, the detectives contemplated the possibility that he may have offended some of his more conservative colleagues, potentially resulting in a hate crime. However, upon interviewing his co-workers, they were taken aback to learn that all of them held Brad in high regard, describing him as a commendable individual. This line of inquiry was swiftly dismissed. The detectives also spoke with Brad's friends and family to establish a timeline and gather pertinent information. According to statements from David and Sherry at the scene, Brad had recently terminated a toxic relationship with a man named Scotty, a fact corroborated by his friend Wendy. She expressed her disapproval of the relationship, noting that Brad had become overly involved with Scotty, leading to increasingly troubling circumstances. Pursuing this lead, the detectives obtained Scotty's full name and promptly visited his residence to question him. However, upon their arrival, Scotty's mother informed them that he had been incarcerated for 3 months. Scotty was incarcerated for several months due to a probation violation, which initially excluded him as the primary suspect. However, the detectives did not entirely dismiss him from their inquiries. They speculated that he could have orchestrated the crime from prison with the assistance of an accomplice. The police approached Scotty in jail to inform him of his ex-boyfriend's death and to observe his reaction. Scotty appeared genuinely affected by the news, and by the conclusion of the interview, the detectives were close to eliminating him as a suspect. In their quest for answers, the detectives decided to canvass the neighborhood to determine if any surveillance cameras had captured footage near Brad's residence. Fortunately, a neighbor possessed a camera directed at the street adjacent to Brad's home, which could potentially provide insights into who had entered or exited the area. While they began analyzing the extensive footage, they continued to interview friends and family. The investigation seemed to be at an impasse until 2 days later when the detectives spoke with Brad's cousin, whose testimony significantly altered the course of the investigation. She disclosed that on the day of the incident, Brad had departed from a family lunch gathering between 1:30 and 2 p.m., but not before mentioning that a man named DJ was expected to visit him. She noted that Brad had jokingly remarked about planning to take a nap with his guest, implying a romantic interest. Additionally, she revealed that Brad had confided in her about his relationship with a married man, indicating that DJ had not yet disclosed their homosexual relationship to his wife. She also informed the detectives that Brad and DJ had been involved for several years. Despite his initial reluctance to disclose the true identity of Brad's lover, he ultimately succumbed to the pressure exerted by the lead investigator, who revealed a shocking name. The officer was taken aback to learn that DJ was, in fact, David, the very individual who had discovered Brad's lifeless body. When questioned about her assertions, she affirmed that David was the only person Brad had ever mentioned to her. The detectives later remarked that the revelation of DJ being David, the one who found the body while visiting the residence with his family, clarified many aspects of the case. Until that moment, David had been regarded as a crucial witness, appearing genuinely distraught in mourning the loss of his friend. However, this unforeseen development swiftly transformed him into the primary suspect. Under the pretense of needing to collect photographs from his phone related to the crime scene, the detectives persuaded David to surrender his device. In truth, they were tracking his whereabouts during the time of Brad's murder and seeking evidence that might indicate a relationship beyond mere friendship. Upon examining the phone's location data, they found that David's device had been at Brad's residence at the time of the fatal shooting. Although David had erased incriminating messages, a more thorough forensic analysis revealed text exchanges between him and Brad that substantiated their sexual relationship. Meanwhile, the team analyzing footage from a neighbor's surveillance camera confirmed that David had indeed driven to Brad's house shortly before the estimated time of the incident. David notably arrived in his wife's vehicle rather than his own. The duration of his visit was documented, revealing that he departed approximately 40 minutes later. The footage also recorded David returning hours later in his truck, accompanied by his family, under the guise of delivering a weed trimmer that Brad had allegedly requested. After gathering this evidence, the police felt assured they possessed sufficient proof that David had been present at Brad's residence both prior to and during the time of his death. It was now time to confront him with the facts. When detectives presented David with the incriminating information obtained from his phone, he acknowledged being at the house but altered his narrative multiple times throughout the extensive interrogation, providing as many as 7 or 8 different accounts of the events. At one point, David asserted that a third, unidentified individual had been in Brad's house and, following a heated dispute, this unknown person shot Brad. He claimed that this man had threatened him into silence before permitting him to leave. However, the detective expressed skepticism regarding this account, prompting David to revise his story once more. When pressed for the truth, David ultimately admitted to concealing his affair from his wife, Sherry, but maintained that it had only lasted a few months, not years. He contended that Brad had not been pressuring him to leave his wife and cohabitate, but had instead become enraged when David attempted to terminate their romantic involvement that afternoon. David alleged that Brad had brandished a firearm, waving it in his face, which instilled fear in him, leading to an escalation into a physical confrontation. David managed to wrest the firearm from Brad and subsequently shot him in the forehead, claiming that his actions were in self-defense. He also acknowledged firing an additional shot at Brad while he lay on the ground. However, detectives quickly dismissed this narrative, highlighting that the fundamental principles of physics rendered David's account implausible. Forensic examinations of Brad's body indicated that he had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, both to the back of the head, suggesting that the shooter had been positioned behind him. When questioned about the firearm, David stated that he had discarded it while fleeing the scene. In the ensuing days, law enforcement conducted extensive searches in the area, yet the murder weapon was never located. Despite the absence of the weapon, investigators were confident in their case against David. Prior to his incarceration, he was permitted to speak with his wife, Sherry. Their conversation was closely monitored by detectives, during which David confessed to the affair and expressed remorse for not managing the situation differently, acknowledging that he could not reverse his actions. Sherry, taken aback by the gravity of his admission, was left speechless. David reiterated his earlier statements to the detectives, prompting Sherry, in tears, to question whether he was mocking her and to express her inability to look at him. This exchange confirmed to the police that Sherry had been unaware of the events that had unfolded without her knowledge. On May 9th, David was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators speculated that Brad, frustrated by the ongoing situation, had a concealed relationship likely posed a risk of exposing the truth to Sherry, providing David with a motive to eliminate his friend and sustain his dual existence. After several days in custody, David appeared in court for an extensive preliminary hearing in mid-May 2017, where he faced charges for Brad's murder. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained his gaze on the floor as investigating officers provided testimony, while prosecutors highlighted the discrepancies in his account. The police described David as visibly shaken at the murder scene, exhibiting physical distress that included difficulty breathing and episodes of vomiting. They also recounted David's initial written statement, in which he portrayed himself as merely a friend who had come to deliver a weed trimmer and had accidentally stumbled upon Brad's lifeless body in the basement. The lead investigator presented David's final statement, in which he admitted to shooting Brad in self-defense, although the weapon was never recovered despite thorough searches. The autopsy results emerged as a pivotal moment, completely undermining David's self-defense argument, as they revealed that Brad had been shot twice in the back of the head, contradicting the notion of self-defense. David's defense attorney addressed the court, contending that David did not represent a danger to society and that the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Brad's death were exceptional. He argued that if a crime had occurred, it should be classified as manslaughter rather than murder, asserting that David had acted in self-defense. Meanwhile, David remained silent. During the nearly 3-hour hearing, the proceedings remained quiet as witnesses provided their testimonies. After thoroughly reviewing all evidence and statements, the judge determined there was probable cause to forward the case to the county court, setting bail at $1 million. In response, David's defense team promptly sought a reduction in the bail amount, contending that it was unfeasible for David to afford such a sum. However, the judge rejected this request. Several weeks later, David's attorney submitted over a dozen motions during a subsequent hearing, including another appeal for a reduction in bail. Numerous friends and family members attended to express their support for David. The attorney proposed lowering the bail to $250,000, a figure deemed manageable by the Kenny family. He called several witnesses to testify, including David's wife, mother, father-in-law, and stepfather, all of whom attested to David's commendable character, portraying him as an honorable, diligent, and responsible individual, as well as a devoted husband and father. Sherry testified that her husband had consistently provided both emotional and material support to their 3 children for the past decade, despite not being their biological father. During cross-examination, Sherry was questioned regarding the events of May 7th, when David took her and their daughter to Brad's residence. She stated that her husband had mentioned they were returning a weed trimmer. When the judge inquired if David had exhibited any unusual behavior that day, Sherry responded that she did not observe anything out of the ordinary. She recounted their arrival, knocking on the door, discovering the back door ajar, and entering the house. The premises appeared to have been thoroughly searched prior to David's descent into the basement, where he called for her to contact 911. After considering the arguments presented, the judge determined that the testimonies concerning David's character did not warrant a reduction in bail. His ruling was influenced by the fact that the defendant had taken his wife and daughter to a location where a deceased individual was found, claiming he was merely passing through and unaware of the circumstances. The judge further noted that David had egregiously misled his wife and daughter. Subsequently, David's trial commenced and extended over a week. During the proceedings, the prosecution introduced evidence previously discussed, including surveillance footage from neighbors that captured David arriving at Brad's residence prior to the crime and later returning with his family. Additionally, police body camera recordings were presented, which clearly indicated that David had been dishonest from the outset. A particularly compelling piece of testimony came from a forensic expert who analyzed the DNA evidence collected at the scene. The expert disclosed that DNA from a used condom contained Brad's DNA on the exterior and that of an unidentified male on the interior, with no evidence of David's DNA present. This finding sparked controversy as it contradicted the claims made by a detective who suggested that David had resolved to eliminate Brad to protect his secrets and family life. The detective alleged that David had lured Brad under the pretense of sexual engagement, subsequently murdered him, and attempted to conceal the crime. In contrast, the defense argued that David had acted out of fear and in self-defense. The attorney acknowledged that David had not consistently been truthful and that some of his behaviors were peculiar. However, he emphasized that this did not equate to David being a criminal. The prosecution countered this argument by asserting that 2 bullets to the back of the head could not be justified as acts of self-defense, highlighting that Brad had been kneeling when he sustained the first shot to the upper part of his head, followed by a second shot to the lower part of his skull. After the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 4 hours, creating a tense atmosphere in the courtroom. When the jury returned, the judge announced the unanimous verdict: David Kenny was found guilty of the aggravated murder of Brad. This verdict elicited gasps and tears from those in attendance. Before the sentencing, David was given a chance to address the court. He expressed his remorse to Brad's family for the pain and suffering he had inflicted, stating that he never intended for the situation to escalate and wished he could reverse the events. David recognized that no apology could restore Brad to life, but he wanted the family to understand his genuine regret for the tragedy. Nevertheless, the judge remained unmoved by David's expressions of sorrow. The judge recounted the numerous falsehoods David had told to obscure his actions, characterizing the crime as a cold and calculated execution followed by a sophisticated cover-up. The judge noted that David had premeditated Brad's murder, having lured him under the pretense of sexual engagement, orchestrated the crime scene, and taken various measures to hide his wrongdoing. The judge had 4 sentencing options, all of which involved life imprisonment, albeit with differing possibilities for parole. After a span of 20, 25, or 30 years, David's defense attorney implored the judge to consider one of several lenient options, arguing that David had been a law-abiding citizen with no prior criminal history before the unfortunate events of that day. Conversely, the prosecutor urged the judge to impose a life sentence without the possibility of parole, stressing that Brad had lost his life and that his family would endure that loss indefinitely. In response, the judge expressed concerns, stating that if David was capable of taking the life of someone who loved him and was his closest friend, it raised serious questions about his potential actions towards those who might oppose him. Consequently, the judge determined that David could not be permitted to return to society. In February 2018, David was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 3 years for a firearm specification, indicating that he had possessed a weapon during the commission of the crime. Law enforcement officials remarked that the entire situation was a tragedy that could have been averted had David not been so preoccupied with concealing his homosexuality. As of mid-2023, prison records indicated that David remained incarcerated in Ohio. His attorney had consistently sought to appeal the sentence, aiming for the possibility of parole for his client, but those appeals were ultimately denied. Tragically, while David would never return to the coal mines, neither would Brad, as both their lives had been irrevocably changed by David's actions. Thank you for tuning in to Unreal True Crime.